National 5 historians, and welcome to the next lesson in our Hitler and Nazi Germany topic. This lesson is on the Reichstag Fire. So in this lesson what we really want to do is explain how Hitler went from Chancellor in January of 1933 to becoming Fuhrer in August of 1934. So make a note somewhere for the heading and then continue the lesson. So the next slide has a really nice timeline of events of Hitler's rise to power and what we're kind of looking at. So the bit we've already seen in the last lesson was Hitler's appointment as Chancellor in January 1933. The next stage from that, which we're going to look in this lesson and I alluded to in the last lesson, was this big disaster which happened, which was on the 27th of February 1933 when the Reichstag building caught fire and burned to the ground. Ultimately, what this meant for Germany was that the Reichstag Fire laws were then passed, which basically meant martial law for Germany, where the Chancellor was able to take quite a lot of authority. This led to the March 1933 elections, where Hitler and the Nazi Party did win quite a number of seats, and then ultimately to the Enabling Act being passed on the 23rd of March 1933 as well, which pretty much gave the Chancellor all of the authority of the emergency powers that the Weimar Constitution had built in. On the 14th of July 1933, with this power in his control, Hitler then passed the law against the establishment of political parties, which outlawed every party that could then oppose Hitler and the Nazis. The only thing that really stood against him or in his way from that point on was Hindenburg, who was president and technically still above him, but Hindenburg was very ill by this point in time, and von Hindenburg then died in August 1934. Quite soon after his death in August 1934, Hitler becomes the Fuhrer and complete control over Germany is established. So we are roughly kind of about this part here, and what we're going to look at in this lesson is these kind of Reichstag Fire elements in a little bit more detail. So you can take a note of this timeline if you want to, so you can see where we're headed, but you don't have to, you just have to have a quick look at it just now and then move on. So despite being made Chancellor, Hitler still did not have total control over Germany. Three things hindered him. 1. Hindenburg, president, still outranked him, disliked him. 2. The Parliament, a coalition government at the time. 3 out of 11 cabinet members were Nazi, but it still then meant some were not. And then the party as well. The SA, under Ernst Röhm, who was in charge, were threatening to split the Nazi party. Röhm wanted Hitler to place the country's army under SA control. Hitler refused to do that, so there was a potential that the Nazi party would split, which meant that Hitler would lose his majority and lose the control of the party that he had at that point in time. So these three things are kind of still really important, and we're just going to take a note. So how did Hitler ultimately set about destroying the Weimar Republic? He'd always intended to destroy the democratic Weimar Republic. Although he was Chancellor, the Nazi Party didn't dominate the Reichstag or the government of Germany. They still needed the support from the smaller parties. The Communists were definitely still a threat. They were attracting quite a lot of voters and challenged the Nazi Party for seats at this point in time. Hitler needed to increase the number of Nazis in the Reichstag, so new elections would have to be held in March 1933. And he did this saying that what he wanted was ultimately to have this control over the party in a way that was democratic, so the Nazis would have to have this as an election. So here you can see each of the individual presidents and chancellors that had existed up to this point. We've got Ebert, Stresemann, Hindenburg himself, obviously now Hitler, with Brüning, von Papen, von Schleicher as well. So after being promoted in January, he persuaded Hindenburg to dissolve the Reichstag and call for the new election on the 25th of March. We then have all this kind of violence and all this organisation happening, where there's marches and there's flag waving, people being beaten up in the streets, communists in particular. And then a disaster strikes. On the 27th of February 1933, 1 week before the election was due, the Reichstag itself, the building, caught on fire. and it was very badly damaged, as you can see in some of these pictures and photos here. Obviously, what are we going to do about this in Germany at the time? Something drastic, because that seems to be what they're doing. The blaze destroyed the building, and Hitler immediately blamed the communists and decreed terrorist activity had threatened Germany, and it would have to be dealt with. But the question has to become, who actually started this fire? A Dutch communist was found inside the building, Marinus van der Lubbe. He admitted responsibility. He was partially cited. He was unemployed as a bricklayer. He had previous convictions for fire raising, for setting fires and things like that, and he admitted that he'd done it. A lot of historians have discussed this idea of why the Reichstag fire was actually useful to Hitler. Ultimately, he was able to convince people that the communists were trying to take power by terrorism. He said, there will be no mercy now, every communist official will be shot where he stands, and he was able to have the communists banned from the Reichstag, which is very lucky for him because they were his biggest rival and threat at this point in time. So all I want you to do with this slide is just kind of take some bullet points on the Reichstag fire. So we're going to say a Dutch communist was found inside the building. Obviously we're going to name him. Admitted responsibility. Hitler was able to convince people that the communists were trying to take power by terrorism, and obviously yours will be much neater than my madcap attempt to highlight without a mouse. Our quote from Hitler, and the fact that he had the communists banned from the Reichstag, which was lucky as the election was only in a few days from that point. Matches were found in van der Lubbe's pockets. In the German police report, he confesses to the fire as a protest against Nazi rule, although he may have been tortured first to actually get this information out, and he was sentenced to execution on the 10th of January 1934 by beheading. In 2008, new evidence came to light and he was pardoned for the crime. Now, the question of whether or not he actually did this is one that historians have debated for a while. The fire was found to have started in 20 different locations. Could one man have actually been responsible for doing this? Was it the Nazis themselves? Did they use him as a pawn? Were other communists involved and helped them start the fire? Göring allegedly stated, the only one who really knows about the Reichstag building is I, for I set fire to it. So he kind of indicated that it was the Nazis that had planned this all along. So obviously, just to add to your notes on the Reichstag fire, we're just going to say he had matches found in his pockets. In the German police report, he confesses, although he may have been tortured first, and he was executed on the 10th of January 1934 by beheading. So this then led to something called the Reichstag Fire Law, and this is a new note that we're going to take, so just put this as a heading and then have a look at some of the information that we're going to have next. So Hitler started a terror campaign within about an hour of the Reichstag fire happening. Roughly about 4,000 communists were arrested and 50 of them were killed by the SA. He persuaded Hindenburg to use Article 48 to pass an emergency law known as the Decree for the Protection of the People and State, which we now know or we call the Reichstag Fire Law. Okay, which again, it's quite a big note that we're taking from this. Okay, so make sure you're only writing the things that are highlighted. This basically took away all of these basic rights that the German people had gained under the Weimar Republic. So the law prevented the communist and the social democratic parties from campaigning in the election. The newspapers became censored. Private letters and calls could be checked and opened. Warrants for house searches as well weren't necessarily allowed. They could just walk in. Newspapers that were belonging to any opponents of the Nazis were immediately closed down, and people could be detained without trial. They also introduced the death penalty for acts of treason, which is why our fire starter was given the death penalty as a result. So we're just going to say it prevented these people from campaigning. Newspapers become censored. Didn't need warrants and things for house searches. Newspapers belonging to opponents closed. People detained without trial, and death penalty for acts of treason. And this was legally passed and allowed. We've got this enactment video about how the fire actually helped Hitler. It's from Rise of Evil. I will put the link to it in the team as well, and you can go and have a look at it on YouTube if you wanted to, just to kind of refresh yourself of how this would have kind of looked in this reenactment. Ultimately, the result of this. In the last few days before the election, the Nazis increased their use of propaganda, bombarding the people with anti-communist messages. The other parties could not campaign. The Nazis suggested that the communists were planning a revolution, and this sparked fear in a lot of people, so they voted for the Nazi party to try and stop this. They gained 288 seats, which was more than they ever had before. So I'm just going to kind of summarise this slide here. So in the last few days before the election, the Nazis increased their use of propaganda. The other parties could not campaign. The Nazis suggested the communists were planning a revolution. The fear of this caused many people to vote for the Nazis. They gained 288 seats. So the March election went ahead, however it didn't give Hitler what he actually wanted. Even though he got more seats than ever, he only received 44.5% of the vote. Ultimately what this means is after the election he doesn't have full majority. So he suggested a new law, the Enabling Act. Okay, and this is a new note that we're going to just take for this, so the Enabling Act. Basically what it did is it gave him as Chancellor complete total power for 4 years without having to consent the Reichstag on any sort of policies or laws that he wanted to pass. 2/3 of the Reichstag had to agree to this. Okay, ultimately it didn't really matter because the KPD and SPD had been arrested or were in hiding, so there was no opposition left. The German National People's Party, which was Alfred Hurenberg's right-wing party, could obviously be relied upon. Remember, millions stand behind Hitler, so that was actually fine. They would support him. And he made a deal, Hitler that is, with the Centre Party, that if they sided with him on this, then he would protect the rights of the church and would ensure that religious schools were allowed to continue in Germany. So they supported him as well. The SA then lined the route to the temporary home of the Reichstag, which was the Kroll Opera House, and intimidated other people to kind of support the act and not to act against it, so that they would know that if they did, when they came out, they had to then deal with the force of the SA. It was passed on the 23rd of March 1933. And again, it's a big note that we're taking for the Enabling Act, but it's key information. By the 14th of July 1933, a new law was declared that the Nazi Party were the only legal party in Germany, and this was the law against the establishment of political parties. Hitler also, in this same act, banned trade unions and ordered the creation of concentration camps to imprison anybody who might oppose him. And that was 150,000 people by the end of 1933. This pictured him here shows some of the political prisoners arriving at one of these first concentration camps in 1933, being sent there purely as political prisoners so that they did not oppose Hitler and the Nazis and could not organise any sort of resistance. Hitler then renewed the act in 1937 and then again in 1941. So now after the Enabling Act has been passed, it allows Hitler and the Nazis to start to consolidate their power a little bit. The only thing that is really stopping them is still these two kind of principles. You've got the split of the Nazi Party, which we're going to come back to and Hitler's going to come back to later, and you've got President Hindenburg as well. The other sort of issues though have been now taken care of. The only thing that is still a potential problem is the church. After banning the trade unions and the political parties, the only thing that is left that might actually be able to oppose the Nazis as a mass group are churches. Hitler worried that if he took legal action against them, that the Germans and the German people might stand up against the Nazis to protect their faith and protect the church in general. So this is going to be just a new heading to add in after our Enabling Act information. So control of the churches. And we're just going to say after banning trade unions and political parties, the churches were the only mass group that might be able to stand up to oppose the Nazis at this point in time. Hitler worried that if he took legal action against them, the Germans might stand up against the Nazis. So just a key note from that information there. So instead, in July 1933, Hitler decided that he was going to sign an agreement with the churches, and in particular the Catholic Church, which became known as the Concordat. This agreement basically guaranteed that the Nazis would leave the church organisations alone, such as the schools and the youth groups, and the Catholic Church would basically just not interfere with politics. It was a win-win situation for everybody and a really simple way around this problem. So that effectively took care of the Catholic Church. The Protestant Church, however, was a different thing. But there was actually so many different Protestant churches across Germany, it actually arguably made controlling each one of these much easier because they were so spread out and they were not all in one place. What Hitler tried to do with these, instead of kind of making the same sort of agreement with them, as he did with the unified Catholic Church, was he tried to replace these with the Nazi-approved Reich Church, which taught religious beliefs from a Nazi perspective. And this allowed him to kind of try to change the way people thought and bring them more into the Nazi way of thinking. So, this means that by this point in time, Hitler has created a dictatorship entirely by legal means. However, he was still worried about the German army and the SA. We can really summarise his slogan at this point in time as this: one Germany, one people and one leader. The only problem was that there was still a different leader in President Hindenburg. The SA, also being a problem for Hitler, was led by Ernest Röhm. He was an old friend of Hitler's. He was quite ambitious. He really wanted to break up the regular army and put all the German soldiers under SA control. Now, Hitler was worried because he was afraid that the army officers might be provoked into leading a revolution against the Nazis if they were being forced to be controlled by the SA. The SA's leaders were becoming a problem as well, so they had to go. But we're going to come back to this in the next lesson. You can see them there, all decked out in their brown shirts and their uniforms. So with the SA problem solution coming later on, the two kind of main problems that Hitler still faces is the army and President Hindenburg. Hindenburg's problem was solved quite easily in August 1934 when he died. Because although he was still very powerful, he was worried about the influence that Hindenburg actually had. So, quick note under new heading for the death of Hindenburg. He was worried about the influence of President Hindenburg. The German president was a national hero due to his war exploits, so Hitler's actions were sometimes limited by them. And I don't think we need to write that, we just need to write that first top bit there. So President Hindenburg dies on August 2nd, 1934. Hitler had already agreed with the cabinet that when Hindenburg died, the offices of President and Chancellor would be combined. Hindenburg's last wish in his will, which he had dictated and wrote down, was that when he died, that there would not be a presidency necessarily after him, that the Kaiser, or at least the royal family, the monarchy, would be restored, and they would develop a constitutional monarchy, kind of similar to what Britain had, with the idea being that they could then move forward as a democratic nation. Obviously, Hitler manages to ignore these wishes. He doesn't publish the president's will at all, and he combines these two roles. The combination, however, of these two roles had been utterly forbidden by the Weimar Constitution. They weren't allowed to actually have that. Now, in order to make that more respectable, what they did is they held a plebiscite, which is basically like a referendum, where they asked the people of Germany, do you mind if these two roles are combined? And 90% of the electorate actually voted in favour of Hitler's actions. So they said, yeah, that's not a problem, let's just combine these into one role. So just a quick heading there about the combination of the state, Hitler becoming the president and chancellor, the fact that it had been forbidden. To make the change more respectable, a plebiscite was held and 90% voted in favour. This is what the ballot would have possibly looked like, and you can kind of see the kind of differences between the yes box and the no box. So if you're being asked to do this, it's a case of, do you want this to happen? Yes, huge gigantic box straight in the middle, or no, tiny box at the side. Now, this wouldn't necessarily have been something that you wanted people to see you ticking no with. Again, a lot of intimidation and things like that, so ticking this big yes box was quite a common thing, which is possibly why so many people were for it. It is also worthwhile remembering that it wasn't just because of intimidation. The Nazis had kind of showed themselves to be, in the past during the Depression and things like that, more able than the Weimar government had been, so there were a lot of people, especially the wealthy people who had supported the Nazis as well, willing to actually tick this box and say yes. So this meant Hitler now had a new title for himself, Fuhrer, and this is the Fuhrer Principle. So he's now Fuhrer, or dictator, the sole leader in Germany, and no one could challenge his power. He then would later replace the Weimar Republic's democracy, for what was left of it, with the Nazi totalitarian state. And officially, that is Hitler in complete control of Germany. When we refer to totalitarian states, what we are really talking about is any political system where all authority is in the hands of the state, so they control public and private life. And that's exactly what Hitler had developed. As we go through the kind of next bits of the topic, we're going to talk about how this private life and public life was actually controlled by the Nazis in a little bit more detail. Basically, for this to work, there has to be a single leader of a single party who has total power, and that's what Hitler has turned the Weimar democracy into, the Nazi totalitarian state. Within hours of Hindenburg's death, Hitler also arranged for every member of the armed forces to swear an oath of loyalty to him. Previously, they'd sworn an oath of loyalty to the people and to the fatherland, not to the individual president. But between January 1933 and August 1934, Hitler had then been slowly sort of destroying the Weimar Republic from within, and this was kind of the last vestige of democracy that was left. He created a dictatorship, nothing could be left to stand in his way, and his only two barriers that are left is the potential for the army to go into revolt and the SA. And by having them swear this oath of loyalty to him, he will ensure that they will stay on side. So every member of the armed forces to swear an oath of loyalty to Hitler, and that's part of this destruction of the Weimar Republic. This is what the oath looked like. It says, I swear by God, the sacred oath, that I will render unconditional obedience to the Fuhrer of the German Reich and people, Adolf Hitler, the supreme commander of the armed forces, and will be ready as a brave soldier to risk my life at any time for this oath, which meant that they had now promised their allegiance to Hitler and the Nazi Party, and they had promised their allegiance to this totalitarian regime. So we now know about Hitler's appointment as Chancellor, Hindenburg doing this because he has no other choice in January 1933. As the elections are coming up that Hitler has demanded that Hindenburg do, persuaded him to do, the Reichstag fire catches and obviously destroys the Reichstag building. This leads to the act of terrorism claim from Hitler about the communist people being beat up, and we have the Reichstag fire law, the emergency laws being passed, which gives greater authority to the Chancellor. The elections then take place with pretty much the Nazis having no one really opposing them because they're all banned due to the Reichstag fire laws, and he is then able to get more seats in the Reichstag. He still doesn't have the majority, but he's then able to make agreements with other parties, which then allows him to pass the Enabling Act in March 1933 as well, giving him total and complete emergency control powers for a 4-year period. After this, in July 1933, he passes a new law, the law against the establishment of political parties, which outlaws every party apart from the Nazis, bans the trade unions, and pretty much bans everything, sets up the concentration camps and sends people there as political prisoners. The only thing really that is allowed, that is still in his way at this point in time, is the church, which he makes the agreements with, as we saw, and tries to establish his own church as well, which we'll come back to in a bit more detail, but helps that get control, so he has no real opposition. He's left with kind of two problems, the SA, and he has the problem of Hindenburg. Hindenburg dies in August 1934, which allows him to combine the role of Chancellor with the role of President, and by August 1934 Hitler has become Fuhrer of Germany, and the German totalitarian state, as we know it, has been born and now exists. So, summary assignment for this, and what you have to do for this lesson's assignment is make a copy of this table looking at these important events which helped Hitler towards becoming a dictator. So you've got him as Chancellor, you've got the Reichstag fire, all the way down to this oath of allegiance that we just talked about. In each box I've already filled in for you about whether or not violence, fear, the electoral system or laws were actually used to actually pass it, apart from the oath of alliance. At the bottom, and what you need to do once you've made a copy of this table is decide what the justifications first in that other one is, and I've given you the first couple. So why did this actually help Hitler? And it's just in your own words, whatever reasons that you want, short sort of reasons, and then once you've done that I want you to go back and decide out of these which ones are the most important. Okay. So you've got 9 here, so it shouldn't be 1 to 9. Decide which ones are the least important, which is your number 9, and then which one is the most important in Hitler becoming a dictator. What is the most important reason? Once you've done this, take a photo of it and upload it to the team for your assignment. And if you've got any questions or anything you're not sure about, email your teacher, put a message in the team and let us know how you're getting on.